In the brutal theater of medieval politics, few deaths were designed to send a message as clear and terrifying as what befell Hugh Despenser the Younger in November 1326. His agonizing screams reverberated across the marketplace of Hereford as executioners meticulously dismantled not just his physical form, but his very persona, obliterating his identity as a man of power. This wasn't merely an execution, it was a carefully orchestrated spectacle of revenge, humiliation, and blatant political theater that sent shockwaves even through a society hardened to public brutality. Hugh Despenser had ascended from relative obscurity as a minor lord to become the de facto ruler of England, second only to King Edward II. For over a decade, he wielded an influence that cowed powerful earls and fueled clandestine plots within the royal court. But when Queen Isabella, a woman scorned and underestimated, finally unleashed her fury, she ensured that Despenser's demise would mirror the cruelty he had so readily inflicted upon others. The method of his death was not chosen for its efficiency, but for the exquisite torment it promised and the symbolic destruction it represented. Medieval chroniclers, typically restrained in their depictions of violence, chronicled Despenser's execution with unsettling detail and thinly veiled satisfaction. They understood they were witnessing not just the end of a man, but the violent culmination of one of England's most convulsive political dramas. The sheer barbarity of his death speaks volumes about the profound fear and virulent hatred he engendered during his ascent to power. What forces conspired to transform a seemingly insignificant nobleman into the shadowy overlord of a kingdom? And what manner of reign justifies such an elaborately sadistic execution? The story of Hugh Despenser is a chilling cautionary tale of unchecked ambition, the insidious nature of royal favoritism, and the inevitable catastrophic price of absolute power. His rise was meteoric, his grip on the levers of power absolute, and his fall utterly devastating. Now, we delve into the murkiest depths of medieval England to unearth the twisted saga of the king's favorite who dared to soar too close to the sun, only to be consumed by the flames of his own hubris. This is the story of how unbridled political ambition morphed into a gruesome death sentence, and how medieval justice, often dispensed with chilling precision, could prove far more terrifying than any instrument of torture ever devised. Hugh Despenser the Younger entered the world around 1286, born into an era where unwavering fealty to the crown could propel a family to unimaginable heights of influence or condemn them to utter annihilation. His father, Hugh Despenser the Elder, had already established the family's reputation as adept courtiers and ruthless political players. The younger Hugh inherited not only his father's lineage, but also his keen cunning and an insatiable hunger for power that would ultimately prove his undoing. The England of Hugh's youth was a kingdom teetering on the cusp of significant transformation. Edward III, the indomitable Hammer of the Scots, had passed away in 1307, bequeathing the throne to his son Edward II. The new king stood in stark contrast to his formidable warrior father. He demonstrated a greater inclination towards rustic pursuits and the companionship of male favorites than to the weighty responsibilities of governing an empire. This perceived weakness at the very heart of power created a fertile breeding ground for ambitious men, and Hugh Despenser was perfectly positioned to exploit it. Edward II's reign was immediately marred by scandal stemming from his intense relationship with Piers Gaveston, a Gascon knight who rapidly became the king's closest confidant and, whisperers claimed, his secret lover. Gaveston's blatant arrogance and the king's unwavering favoritism towards him ignited the fury of the English nobility, who perceived their own influence and prestige dwindling in the shadow of this foreign upstart. The baron's simmering resentment eventually boiled over, culminating in Gaveston's brutal murder in 1312. But this act of violence merely created a vacuum, one that Hugh Despenser was poised to fill with cunning and calculated precision. Unlike Gaveston, who was perceived as an outsider, a foreign interloper, Hugh Despenser was undeniably of English noble stock. He possessed a keen understanding of political maneuvering, a skill Gaveston sorely lacked, realizing that true power lay not in ostentatious displays of royal favor, but in methodically constructing an impregnable position within the existing power structures of the realm. Where Gaveston had been content with empty titles and fleeting wealth, Despenser coveted something far more consequential: genuine control over the intricate machinery of government itself. By 1318, Hugh Despenser had skillfully insinuated himself into the king's innermost circle, becoming Edward II's new favorite and fueling rumors of a far more intimate relationship. But Despenser brought to this connection a degree of political acumen and ruthless ambition that would soon render Gaveston's influence pale in comparison. He harbored ambitions far beyond simply being the king's companion. He aspired to become the king's voice, his guiding hand, and ultimately, his virtual replacement in all but the formal title. The metamorphosis of Hugh Despenser from mere courtier to the shadow ruler of the kingdom commenced with his strategic appointment to key positions within Edward II's administration. By 1322, he had secured the coveted title of Chamberlain, granting him unfettered access to the king at all hours and affording him absolute control over who else could gain an audience with the monarch. This pivotal position became the bedrock of his ever-expanding power, enabling him to meticulously filter information, subtly influence crucial decisions, and progressively isolate Edward from the counsel of other, more experienced advisors. Despenser's methods were characterized by both methodical precision and ruthless efficiency. He commenced by identifying potential threats to his burgeoning power among the ranks of the nobility, and then systematically neutralized them through a calculated combination of legal manipulation, relentless economic pressure, and, when deemed necessary, acts of outright, brutal violence. Lords who dared to voice opposition to him found their ancestral land seized on trumped-up charges, their family members unjustly imprisoned, and their long-held traditional rights summarily stripped away through creative and often spurious interpretations of feudal law. The volatile Welsh marches became Despenser's particular obsession and the primary source of his rapidly accumulating wealth and power. These strategically important border regions, traditionally governed by semi-autonomous lords fiercely protective of their independence, were abundantly rich in fertile land and valuable resources. Despenser skillfully exploited his influence over the pliable king to instigate conflicts with the fiercely independent marcher lords, and then swiftly moved in to lay claim to their coveted territories when they were either defeated in battle or forced into ignominious exile. Within a remarkably short span of time, he had amassed a personal domain that rivaled even the extensive holdings of the crown itself. What rendered Despenser a particularly formidable and dangerous adversary was his profound understanding of the intricacies of bureaucracy and the power of the law. Unlike previous royal favorites who had relied solely on the king's personal protection, Despenser meticulously constructed a complex network of legal justifications to legitimize his every action. He packed the courts with his loyal supporters, skillfully manipulated parliamentary proceedings to his advantage, and created an elaborate paper trail designed to cloak his land grabs and political persecutions in a veneer of legitimacy. This systematic approach ensured that his victims often found themselves legally defenseless, utterly powerless to resist his relentless onslaught. By 1324, Hugh Despenser had for all intents and purposes become the true ruler of England, wielding power and influence far exceeding his formal position. Edward II, increasingly reliant on his favorite's counsel, affection, and unwavering support, rarely made any significant decisions without first consulting him. Foreign ambassadors routinely reported that audiences with the king were essentially meaningless unless Despenser was present, and that the real negotiations, the true exercise of power, transpired in private meetings with the king's all-powerful favorite. The established nobility found themselves increasingly marginalized, cut off from the corridors of power, and relegated to the role of powerless spectators in their own kingdom. The reign of Hugh Despenser was characterized by a systematic campaign of terror directed against anyone who dared to challenge his authority or question his motives. His adversaries didn't merely face political marginalization or social ostracism. They faced complete and utter destruction, their lives and fortunes forfeit to his insatiable ambition. The Earl of Lancaster, one of the most powerful and influential nobles in England, and a cousin to the king himself, was summarily executed in 1322 after rashly daring to rebel against Despenser's overwhelming influence. This shocking execution sent a clear and unambiguous message throughout the kingdom. Not even royal blood could offer protection to those who stood in the path of the king's all-powerful favorite. Despenser's persecution of his enemies extended far beyond mere elimination. He delighted in subjecting them to deliberate humiliation and prolonged suffering, extracting maximum pain and anguish from their downfall. Lords who dared to oppose him were not simply dispatched through a swift execution or condemned to exile. They were first publicly stripped of their dignity through sham trials replete with fabricated charges, forced to endure the agony of watching their families imprisoned or impoverished, and subjected to a carefully curated array of punishments designed to break their spirits long before they broke their bodies. The insidious psychological torture often proved far more effective than any form of physical violence, leaving lasting scars on both the victims and the wider society. The favorite's pervasive network of informants and loyal supporters penetrated every stratum of English society, from the highest echelons of the nobility down to the most humble peasant villages, servants within noble households, clerks working in government offices, and even members of the clergy found themselves either willingly recruited or ruthlessly coerced into serving Despenser's vast intelligence network. This created an atmosphere of pervasive paranoia, where no conversation could be considered safe and no alliance could be deemed entirely secure. The traditional bonds of feudal loyalty, once the bedrock of English society, began to disintegrate under the relentless pressure of Despenser's omnipresent surveillance state. Women were not exempt from Despenser's pervasive cruelty, and in many cases, they suffered disproportionately from his vindictive machinations. The wives and daughters of his enemies were routinely used as pawns, imprisoned in harsh conditions, or forced into strategic marriages that served his political agenda. Lady Alice de Lacy, one of the wealthiest heiresses in all of England, was essentially kidnapped and forced to live under Despenser's direct control, allowing him to freely manage her vast estates for his own personal enrichment. These blatant attacks on defenseless women flagrantly violated the chivalric codes that supposedly governed noble behavior and further fueled the growing outrage and resentment against his increasingly tyrannical rule. Perhaps even more disturbingly, Despenser displayed a profound contempt for the church and its officials, institutions that were traditionally held in the highest esteem during the medieval period. Despite the prevailing reverence for religious authority, he showed no hesitation in imprisoning dissenting bishops, confiscating valuable church lands, and manipulating religious law to suit his own selfish purposes. When Bishop Adam Orleton of Hereford dared to publicly criticize royal policy, Despenser had him summarily arrested and subjected to brutal torture. This sacrilegious behavior deeply shocked contemporary observers and added accusations of blatant impiety to the ever-growing list of charges against the increasingly reviled favorite. The breaking point finally arrived with Queen Isabella herself, a woman of considerable power and influence in her own right. Edward II's queen, the daughter of the King of France, and one of the most politically astute women in Europe, found herself increasingly marginalized and humiliated by Despenser's suffocating dominance over her husband. The arrogant favorite made no attempt to conceal his contempt for the queen, routinely blocking her access to Edward and systematically reducing her household staff and income. But Isabella was not a woman to be easily dismissed or silenced. In 1325, Isabella was dispatched to France to negotiate with her brother, King Charles IV, regarding a contentious dispute over territories in Gascony. This diplomatic mission presented her with the perfect opportunity to escape the oppressive reach of Despenser's influence and begin organizing a resistance movement to challenge his illegitimate regime. Once safely ensconced in France, she wasted no time in gathering support from a diverse coalition of English exiles and disaffected nobles who had fled England to escape Despenser's relentless persecution. Her burgeoning cause gained a significant boost when she forged a powerful alliance with Roger Mortimer, one of the fiercely independent marcher lords who had managed to escape Despenser's earlier purges with his life. Isabella's skillfully crafted propaganda campaign against Despenser was masterful in its elegant simplicity and undeniable effectiveness. She deftly portrayed herself as the wronged queen, unjustly driven from her own kingdom by the unnatural and corrupting influence of her husband's favorite. She relentlessly emphasized Despenser's repeated violations of traditional law and custom, his blatant attacks on the integrity of the church, and his systematic destruction of ancient and noble families. Most effectively, she painted him as a foreign corruption of inherently English values, despite his undeniable English birth, tapping into a deep well of xenophobia and resentment. The Queen's carefully targeted message resonated powerfully with audiences across Europe who were acutely familiar with the inherent dangers of royal favorites and the potential for chaos they represented. Isabella presented herself as the valiant defender of legitimate government against the insidious forces of tyranny, and her cause swiftly attracted support from nobles, merchants, and common people alike, all of whom had suffered directly or indirectly under Despenser's oppressive and self-serving rule. By 1326, she had assembled a formidable invasion force and was finally prepared to return to England and reclaim her rightful place as queen. The invasion itself proved to be almost anticlimactic, a testament to the depth of Despenser's unpopularity. When Isabella landed in Essex in September 1326, she was greeted as a liberator rather than resisted as an invader. The common people, utterly exhausted after years of Despenser's iron-fisted oppression, flocked to her banner in droves, eager to throw off the yoke of his tyranny. More significantly, the nobles, who had been cowed into fearful submission by the threat of the favorite's wrath, seized this long-awaited opportunity for revenge and abandoned Edward II en masse, leaving him politically isolated and vulnerable. Edward II and the Despensers fled westward towards Wales, desperately hoping to find sanctuary in the regions where Hugh's power had once been strongest. But even there, their support rapidly evaporated as local leaders shrewdly calculated that their future prospects lay with the ascendant queen rather than the discredited king and his universally despised favorite. The elaborate network of fear and patronage that had so effectively sustained Despenser's power for so long proved to be built on nothing more substantial than quicksand when finally tested by the forces of genuine opposition. Hugh Despenser the Elder was captured first, seized by Isabella's forces as he bravely attempted to defend Bristol Castle against the invaders. His execution was swift and brutal, a public spectacle designed to intimidate any wavering supporters. He was hanged, drawn, and quartered as a traitor, his severed head displayed on London Bridge as a grim warning to others who might contemplate defying the new regime. But this brutal act was merely the opening act, the appetizer for the main course that would follow when his son was inevitably captured. Hugh Despenser the Younger was finally apprehended near Llantrisant in Wales on November 16, 1326. Contemporary accounts vividly describe him as being utterly broken by the sudden and complete collapse of his carefully constructed world. The man who had terrorized England for over a decade, inspiring fear and dread in the hearts of nobles and commoners alike, was now reduced to a trembling figure, reportedly having attempted to take his own life rather than face the inevitable consequences of his actions. His captors, however, had no intention of granting him such an easy escape from the justice he had so long evaded. The decision regarding Despenser's ultimate fate was never truly in doubt, but the precise method of his execution became a matter of meticulous planning and careful deliberation. Queen Isabella and her closest advisors understood that this death needed to serve multiple crucial purposes. It had to satiate the intense desire for revenge that burned within Despenser's countless victims, serve as a potent deterrent to future royal favorites who might be tempted to amass similar unchecked power, and symbolically cleanse the kingdom of the pervasive corruption he represented. The execution they designed was a macabre masterpiece of medieval political theater, a carefully choreographed spectacle of retribution and purification. On November 24, 1326, Hugh Despenser was brought to Hereford to play out his final agonizing performance on the public stage. The choice of location was particularly significant, laden with symbolic weight. Hereford was situated in the heart of the Welsh Marches, the very region where his power had been at its zenith, and it was also the episcopal see of Bishop Adam Orleton, whom Despenser had subjected to unspeakable torture for daring to challenge his authority. The crowd that gathered was immense, drawn not only by morbid curiosity, but by a genuine and deeply felt desire to witness the long-awaited demise of their oppressor. Despenser was not granted the customary courtesy of a trial, though a lengthy list of his alleged crimes was solemnly read aloud to the assembled crowd, amplifying their collective sense of outrage and fueling their thirst for vengeance. The list was extensive and damning. Treason against the crown, theft of royal lands and resources, the systematic persecution of nobles, attacks on the sanctity of the church, and the corrupting of the king's natural affections. Each individual charge was met with thunderous roars of approval from the assembled crowd, who had waited years for this moment of righteous justice. The executioners had been meticulously instructed in their grisly duties, and they approached their work with the cold precision of skilled craftsmen. This was not to be a simple beheading or hanging. It was to be a carefully orchestrated demonstration of the fate that awaited those who dared to corrupt the divinely ordained natural order of the kingdom. Every aspect of the punishment was imbued with symbolic meaning, and every incision was calculated to inflict maximum suffering while prolonging consciousness to the greatest extent possible. Despenser was first stripped naked and paraded through the crowded streets of Hereford, allowing the assembled masses to fully behold the physical reality of the man who had terrorized them for so long. The once powerful and influential favorite, now reduced to trembling flesh, became an object of public mockery and unbridled hatred. Crude verses mocking his alleged intimate relationship with the king were shouted by gleeful spectators, and refuse was hurled at his defenseless body, further degrading and humiliating him in the eyes of the populace. The actual execution commenced with Despenser being dragged through the streets, tied to the back of a horse, his body repeatedly battered against the unforgiving stones and debris. This preliminary torture served to weaken him physically, while simultaneously providing a spectacle of entertainment for the bloodthirsty crowd. By the time he finally reached the executioner's scaffold, he was already bloodied and barely conscious, but the main event, the culmination of his suffering, was yet to begin. The execution of Hugh Despenser was meticulously designed to be a systematic and comprehensive destruction of his identity as a man, a noble, and ultimately as a human being worthy of dignity. The first stage involved his being suspended by the neck from a makeshift gallows, but the executioner carefully ensured that the hanging would not result in immediate death. The rope was calibrated to inflict agonizing suffering and induce a temporary loss of consciousness without permanently ending his miserable life. As he dangled precariously, gasping for air and choking on his own saliva, the crowd cheered with savage glee, jeering at the man who had once held their lives and fortunes in his tyrannical grip. When Despenser was cut down, still alive but barely clinging to consciousness, the second, even more brutal phase of his execution commenced. In a deliberate and deeply symbolic mockery of his alleged homosexual relationship with King Edward II, the executioners proceeded to castrate him, severing his genitals with a sharpened knife and casting them into a nearby fire, a symbolic purification through flames. This barbaric act was both literal and figurative. It represented the severing of the perceived unnatural bond between the king and his depraved favorite, while simultaneously inflicting the most intimate and profound form of humiliation imaginable. The disembowelment followed, with Despenser's abdomen being brutally cut open and his entrails slowly and agonizingly drawn out while he remained conscious, fully aware of the horror being inflicted upon him. Medieval medical knowledge was sufficiently advanced to enable the executioners to keep their victims alive throughout this excruciating process, and the executioners were highly skilled in prolonging the suffering for maximum dramatic effect. His heart was then cut out and thrown into the same fire that had consumed his genitals, symbolically destroying the very seat of his corrupt affections and treasonous thoughts. Throughout this horrific ordeal, Despenser remarkably remained conscious, his piercing screams mingling with the triumphant cheers of the bloodthirsty crowd. Contemporary chroniclers noted that he appeared to be desperately trying to speak, perhaps attempting to beg for a fleeting moment of mercy or to offer some final belated confession, but his feeble words were completely lost amidst the cacophony of his own unbearable agony and the crowd's joyous celebration of his demise. The man who had once commanded absolute silence whenever he spoke was now utterly unable to make himself heard above the din of his own suffering. The final stage of the execution involved the ritualistic quartering of Despenser's disfigured body. His limbs were securely tied to 4 powerful horses, which were then driven in opposite directions, tearing his body into 4 separate pieces in a spectacular display of dismemberment. His severed head was placed on a spike and displayed on London Bridge, joining that of his father as a gruesome warning to any others who might contemplate challenging the authority of the new regime. The remaining fragments of his dismembered body were distributed to various prominent cities throughout England, ensuring that the spectacle of his destruction was witnessed across the entire kingdom, serving as a stark reminder of the consequences of unchecked ambition and tyrannical rule. The immediate aftermath of Despenser's gruesome execution was characterized by a mixture of widespread celebration and intense political maneuvering. The exhilarated crowds in Hereford celebrated late into the night, treating the death not as a somber execution, but as a joyous and cathartic festival. Derisive songs and satirical poems mocking the deceased favorite rapidly circulated throughout England, many of them explicitly sexual in nature and deliberately designed to further humiliate his memory and denigrate his legacy. Queen Isabella moved swiftly to consolidate her newly acquired power and legitimize her rebellion in the eyes of both the English people and the wider European community. Within weeks of Despenser's death, King Edward II was forced to abdicate the throne in favor of his young son, Edward III. With Isabella serving as regent, the official narrative became that she had valiantly saved England from the insidious corruption of evil counselors and restored legitimate government to the realm. Despenser's execution was presented not as a vengeful act of retribution, but as a necessary act of justice, a vital step towards restoring order and stability to a kingdom teetering on the brink of chaos. The psychological impact of Despenser's execution on the English nobility was profound and lasting, shaping political discourse for generations to come. The elaborate and meticulously planned nature of his demise served as a powerful deterrent to future royal favorites who might be tempted to accumulate similar levels of unchecked power and influence. For generations afterward, ambitious courtiers would vividly remember the gruesome fate of Hugh Despenser when considering how far they dared to push their influence with weak or pliable kings, lest they suffer a similar, agonizing end. The financial consequences of Despenser's dramatic downfall were equally dramatic and far-reaching. His vast estates and accumulated wealth were redistributed among Isabella's loyal supporters, fundamentally reshaping the power structure of the English nobility. Families that had been unjustly impoverished by his relentless persecution suddenly found themselves restored to their former wealth and influence, while those who had collaborated with him during his reign of terror faced financial ruin, political exile, and social ostracism. The international implications of Despenser's demise were significant as well, resonating throughout the courts of Europe. European monarchs and courtiers had watched Despenser's meteoric rise with a mixture of fascination and horror, and his spectacular execution was widely interpreted as a resounding victory for legitimate government over the forces of tyranny and corruption. Isabella's successful rebellion served as an inspiring model for other queens and nobles who faced similar threats from corrupt favorites and weak or ineffectual rulers. The legacy of Hugh Despenser's execution extends far beyond the narrow confines of medieval England, reaching into the broader history of political violence, state power, and the enduring tension between justice and revenge. His death represents one of the most elaborate and symbolically charged executions in English history, meticulously designed not merely to end a life, but to deliver a powerful and enduring message about the catastrophic consequences of overreaching ambition and the inherent dangers of corrupting royal authority. The specific method of his execution, combining hanging, castration, disembowelment, and quartering, became a grim template for the punishment of traitors that would persist in English law until the 18th century, a testament to the enduring power of his gruesome demise. The legal precedent established by his case directly influenced how future cases of high treason were prosecuted and punished, indelibly embedding his suffering into the very structure of English jurisprudence. Modern historians continue to vigorously debate the extent of Despenser's crimes and the ethical question of whether his punishment was truly proportionate to his offenses. While few are willing to defend his actions during his years of unchecked power, many argue that the elaborate cruelty of his execution reveals as much about his enemy's insatiable capacity for vengeance as it does about his own inherent wickedness. The spectacle of his death arguably brutalized English political culture, normalizing extreme violence as an acceptable tool of governance and perpetuating a cycle of retribution and bloodshed. The explicitly sexual aspects of Despenser's punishment, particularly his castration, reflect prevailing medieval attitudes towards homosexuality and the perceived threat posed by unnatural relationships between men in positions of power. His death became a cautionary tale about the perceived dangers of sexual deviance corrupting political authority, a recurring theme throughout English history whenever royal favorites were suspected of engaging in intimate relationships with their monarchs. The psychological dimensions of Despenser's execution also warrant careful consideration. The elaborate and deliberately theatrical nature of his punishment suggests that his enemies required not only his physical death, but also his complete and utter destruction and humiliation, a need to obliterate not only his life, but also his memory. This points to the profound trauma and unbridled rage that his years of oppressive rule had engendered among the English nobility and the common people alike, a deep-seated desire for catharsis through violence. As we reflect on the horrific death of Hugh Despenser the Younger, we are confronted with uncomfortable truths about power, justice, and the darker aspects of human nature that transcend the specific context of the medieval period. His story serves as a stark reminder of how easily unchecked authority can corrupt even those born to privilege and education, transforming them into monsters who view other human beings as mere obstacles to be eliminated or tools to be manipulated. The elaborate cruelty of his execution forces us to critically examine our own deeply held assumptions about justice and proportionality. While Despenser undoubtedly committed serious crimes against countless innocent people, the spectacle of his death raises troubling questions about whether any human being, regardless of the severity of their offenses, truly deserves such systematic torture and humiliation. The enthusiastic participation of the crowd in his suffering reveals the disturbing pleasure that human beings can derive from witnessing the destruction of those they hate, a chilling reminder of our capacity for both righteous indignation and unbridled sadism. The political lessons of Despenser's rise and fall remain acutely relevant in our own time, serving as a cautionary tale for modern societies. His story demonstrates how institutional weakness at the center of power creates opportunities for ambitious and unscrupulous individuals to accumulate dangerous levels of influence through manipulation, intimidation, and the insidious exploitation of fear. The gradual erosion of legal and traditional constraints that enabled his tyrannical rule offers a stark warning about the inherent fragility of democratic institutions and the crucial importance of upholding the rule of law. Perhaps most disturbingly, Despenser's regime gradually normalized extreme behavior through a calculated combination of fear, corruption, and the gradual expansion of what was considered acceptable cruelty, effectively shifting the boundaries of moral conduct. His victims often found themselves complicit in their own oppression, trapped by a system that punished resistance far more severely than it rewarded collaboration. This dynamic reveals how tyranny perpetuates itself by insidiously corrupting the moral framework of entire societies, turning individuals into accomplices in their own subjugation. The ultimate lesson of Hugh Despenser's horrific end may be that the seemingly solid line separating civilization and barbarism is far thinner and more permeable than we would like to believe. His execution, for all its elaborate medieval trappings, was carried out by educated, supposedly Christian people who genuinely believed they were serving the cause of justice. The ease with which they embraced elaborate cruelty in the name of righteousness should serve as a permanent warning about the enduring human capacity for evil, a capacity that transcends historical periods and cultural contexts, and that remains a constant threat to the ideals of justice and compassion. So, as we've seen, the story of Hugh Despenser the Younger is more than just a gruesome tale from the Middle Ages. It's a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked ambition, the fragility of power, and the enduring human capacity for both cruelty and revenge. It highlights how easily justice can be twisted into a spectacle of brutality, and how vital it is to safeguard our institutions against corruption. Now, I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on all of this. Did anything in particular resonate with you? Do you have any questions about Despenser's story or the political climate of the time? Please leave a comment below and let's get a discussion going. I always enjoy hearing your perspectives. And if you found this exploration of medieval history thought-provoking, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on future dives into the fascinating, often unsettling stories of the past. Thanks for watching.